Well, for our message this morning, the title is we're going to be looking at this person called Esther, and she is a main character in the Old Testament, actually has a book named after her. And this message today on Esther, it goes along with what we've been doing as a church body through this entire year. Through this year, kind of the main key phrase that we've had of what God's been doing in our church and through our church is this phrase, restoring an authentic faith. Restoring an authentic faith. That has been really the theme of this last school year. In the fall, we talked about what is restoration. In the winter, we talked about authenticity. What does it mean to live authentic lives, to worship authentically? And in the springtime, we're focusing on that last part, faith. What exactly is faith? What does it mean to live by faith? And through this month of May, we've been going through this series called Heroes of Incredible Faith. And these are heroes in the Old Testament that we're highlighting each week that had those moments of incredible faith. And we're looking at those moments to better understand what faith is by essentially looking at examples of faith in action. Now this morning, we are going to look at a special heroine named Esther. And maybe you've heard of this lady Esther before. Maybe you haven't. But this lady Esther's story is so significant that she has a book of the Bible named after her, right? The book of Esther. If you want to start turning there in the Old Testament, finding that book, you can get that ready. We're actually going to be in chapter 4 today is where we're going to be reading a little bit later on. But before we dive into the book of Esther and Esther's story, I have to point out something very, very, very unique about the whole book of Esther. The book of Esther is peculiar in the Bible because this book, this particular book, has no direct reference to God. In fact, it has no reference to worship. It doesn't use the word prayer or sacrifice. This has been called the most secular book of the Bible. And some even call it the unreligious book of the Bible. You will not find the word God anywhere in its pages. And even more, this book, it takes place in Persia, of all places, when the Jews have been exiled, right? And these are times that, as you look through these pages, even the people who identify as Jewish within this story, honestly, I'd hate to burst a bubble, but they don't act very Jewish in this story. For example, nobody seems to care much about keeping Jewish kosher laws in this story, right? I'm just saying, right? It is probably the most secular book of the Bible. God's not mentioned, prayer's not mentioned, worship's not mentioned. And even the Jewish people don't act super Jewish. So the book of Esther, as we think about it, one of the questions that emerges and gets debated sometimes is, why did this book of Esther even wind up in the Bible in the first place, right? Why did this secular book, what happened? Why did it end up there? Did it just accidentally get tucked into the pages? What's the deal with the book of Esther? Now, those are the types of questions that we're going to start with this morning. And we're going to try to start to understand why this secular book of Esther is so incredibly powerful. And let me just acknowledge this fact before we go any further. Recognize that a Jewish author of this book had to go out of their way at times. It was painstaking writing this book to not mention God anywhere in its pages. The author of this book on purpose does not mention prayer or worship, and even the Jewish customs seem put to the side. Why is that? The author of Esther intentionally never directly mentions God. See, it's this thing as we look at this book, when it doesn't mention God, it's not a bug of the book, it's a feature, right? That God is strangely absent within its pages. So we're going to start this morning trying to figure out and unravel kind of that mystery of the book of Esther. We're going to try to get the big picture overview of this book, and we're going to grasp why this book never directly mentions God. So we're going to start with the big picture overview, and then from there we're going to move in and focus in particular about what makes Esther a heroine of incredible faith. So first of all, big picture, bird's eye view, and then we'll swoop in and get this more direct look at this gal, Esther. Now, this big picture overview of the book, I mentioned that there is the complete absence of God from this book, that word God, and it's no accident. And the author crafted this book with painstaking attention to detail. The bones, the core structure of this book of Esther, it's actually built around 10 feasts. So I've got a slide up on the screen. You can see it. I actually printed it out. You've got it in your bulletin, so you can take it with you later, so you don't have to forget what those 10 feasts are. So there's 10 feasts in the book of Esther, and the book of Esther is essentially structured around these 10 feasts. And maybe in your translation of the Bible, I know in mine, if I'm reading from the NIV, it doesn't use necessarily the word feast. It uses a synonym. It calls them banquets, right? Synonym, same thing. It's 10 banquets is another way to say it. Or these 10 feasts that you see up on the screen. And as we think about these 10 feasts, it kind of highlights the storyline, the core bones, the overview of the book of Esther. See, the first three feasts, feasts 1, 2, and 3, they involve the king of Persia. And honestly, throughout the whole book, he's kind of portrayed as a bit of an oaf, right? He gets real drunk and ends up making some really dumb decisions. He winds up dethroning and banishing his own queen, Vashti, this lady named Vashti. And when the king comes out of his big drunken bender, he realizes that he's been quite dumb, right? He banished his own queen. And the problem is, if the king makes an edict, it cannot be undone. See, like the Persian and the Medes, these people of this region, they had this mindset that, man, the king is perfect, right? He'd never make a mistake. So if he makes a decision and puts it in a law, then it's an edict, it cannot be undone because everything he does is perfect, apparently, right? Apparently not. But this king makes this edict and banishes his own queen. So he's stuck with a problem, and he needs to find a new queen. He can't undo that. So we get feast number 4. And in that fourth feast, a young girl named Esther is inaugurated as the new queen. And unbeknownst to anyone, right, it's kind of a secret in the background, Esther is secretly Jewish. They don't know that at first. And then in Feast 5, we see this evil antagonist of the story. His name is Haman, and he cooks up a plot to kill, to annihilate all the Jews. And he manages to convince this big Olaf, this king of Persia, to sign this edict, right? And as we can remember, once he signs an edict, it cannot be undone. And they decide on the 13th day of the month of Adar, at feast number 5, the Jews will be annihilated, destroyed. And so feast number 5, really what it is it's Haman's victory feast. He knows this cannot be undone. The king's edict has been issued. The Jews will be annihilated. And feast 6 is when this Queen Esther, she goes to the king to make a petition to try to save her people. But she sort of wavers on the edge a little bit. And so at that feast, instead of making the direct petition, she says, well, join me at another feast. Let me invite you to another feast. And that leads us to feast 7, where she musters up the courage, steps out in faith, and makes this petition for her people to be saved. Feasts 8 and 9, going through this book, those are the Jewish celebratory feasts, right? Because the people are delivered from imminent death. They're delivered from annihilation. And the way that that works is the king cannot overrule his first edict, right? He can't change the first edict. So he creates another edict that says, hey, if you are an enemy of the Jews, if you were going to be part of killing the Jews get to kill you first, right? Sort of a brutal turn of events right there. But what ends up happening is those who were going to destroy the Jews instead are destroyed themselves. And so feasts 8 and 9 are really these celebratory feasts because the enemies of the Jews, in trying to destroy them, destroyed themselves. And feast 10, the very last one of the book, it inaugurates a new Jewish feast that's to be celebrated every year. It's the start of a new tradition, the very last feast. And this feast is called Purim. And this is a particular name for a feast. It's kind of peculiar. Purim, what does that mean? Well, the word pur, the first part of that word, essentially, it sort of means dice, right? They had this thing, if you've ever read in the Bible and seen them cast lots, right? They're essentially, that's like rolling the dice, right? They're rolling the dice. So that word pur, you can think of it as someone throwing the dice. And this feast of Purim is essentially the feast of throwing the dice, the feast of chance moments. And the reason why it ends with this feast of chance moments is because the entire book of Esther, right? That was the bones to it. But really the big events, if you're familiar with this book, they sort of happen in between the key feasts. There are all these little independent moments, these chance moments crammed into the spaces in between. So let me just give you a few examples. There's many more than this, but here's a few examples for you. Chance moment. Between feast 4 and 5, right, this chance moment happens where Esther's uncle Mordecai, he just so happens, right, to be sitting on the gates, sitting on the steps in front of the gate to the king's palace. And as he's sitting out there on the steps, just taking a break, right, he's out there, he overhears in the background around the corner some of the guards plotting to assassinate the king. And Mordecai is able to save the king's life because Mordecai just so happened to be at the right place at the right time. Or when evil Haman, another one, he's plotting to kill the Jews, right? He's making up this plot, and he sets the date for their annihilation, for their destruction, literally by picking up a set of dice and rolling the dice for the date. And he rolls this dice, and that's how he sets the date. And it just so happens that the date is not tomorrow, right? That'd be bad. The date is 12 months from now, a year from now. Just so happens to give Esther enough time for this critical opportunity to save her people. The book is crammed full of these chance moments that happen, whether it's rolling the dice or just being at the right place at the right time, being in the perfect position to save her people. Or even the night before Mordecai is to be executed, right? Mordecai's on death row. He's about to be executed, and the king of Persia just so happens to have a sleepless night. He just can't fall asleep. He's rolling, tossing, and turning. And so he sends a scribe in, and what puts us to sleep better than reading legal documents, right? To have a lawyer come in and read you a big pile of legal documents. He says, that is perfect. I'm going to have him read these legal documents to me, and that will definitely put me to bed, right? So he has a lawyer come in, one of his scribes come in, reading the chronicles of these court rulings, and it just so happens on the sleepless night when the lawyer comes in to read the chronicles that the lawyer reads how this guy Mordecai saved the king's life. He'd completely forgotten. A sleepless night by chance. And then the next day, Haman himself just so happens to have a mix-up in identity. He gets mixed up, right? He thinks that the king is talking about him, when in reality he was talking about Mordecai. These chance opportunities all through the book, one after the other, filling in the skeleton of the book with all the details. That classic case of mistaken identity. The list goes on. I only mentioned 5 of them to you. If you read through this book or if you're familiar with it, you will realize there are tons more in there. Those are just 5 big ones that fill in the cracks between the 10 feasts. And so get this, right? The book of Esther, it ends with the Feast of Purim, the festival of chance moments. Because this is the book of the Bible where nowhere within its pages is God mentioned directly. He seems completely absent when his people are broken and in exile, when it looks like God has failed his people and they're about to be destroyed by an irrevocable edict. And we want to ask, God, where are you? Have you abandoned us? The book ends with a feast in which we are designed to pause and look back to the spaces and the gaps within the story, the spaces between the main events. You know, I included this image in your bulletin, and when I was preparing it and giving it to Lori, our secretary Lori, to print and stuff in there, she looked at it and she didn't like something about that insert. She actually criticized it a little bit. She says, you know what? Wait a minute, Michael. You mislabeled something on this bulletin, on that insert. You said these were all chance moments. And these are not chance moments. You're supposed to label these God moments. I purposefully left that label chance moments on there for you because it's actually part of the point of the book of Esther. The author never mentions God on purpose. The people are under threat in a hostile culture, and the whole point of this book is shaped around this idea that we need to stop and look back to those chance moments one more time. The book ends with a feast where every year we are supposed to stop and look back at our own story, go back to our own life story, and look back to those moments where we thought, man, God, you were never mentioned in my story. Those moments where we said, God, where are you? We're supposed to look back to those moments and look at the spaces in between all those chance moments in our life. Now, this is the bird's eye view of the book, right? The grand overview. And maybe you get it now. Part of why the author would intentionally never mention God. Because sometimes in our life, God can be 100% at work, but it's almost incognito. He's guiding and working and present in our lives, but you won't see him in the main story events because he's filling in all the gaps in between. Now that we've got a bit of a handle on the book of Esther as a whole, let's zoom in to the person Esther and see a little bit more about why she is a heroine of incredible faith. So I'm going to read for you Esther chapter 4. I'm going to read the whole chapter. It's 17 verses. And if you're wondering where this chapter fits into our nice little outline, this is the chance moment on that little outline right after Haman's victory feast. Feast number 5. Haman has just put in that irrevocable edict that the Jews will be destroyed. And this moment we're going to read, it happens before chapter 6. This is that chance moment that's labeled on there, the perfect position. So let's read about it and see a little bit more. So Esther chapter 4, verses 1 through 17. When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. But he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. In every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's eunuchs and female attendants came and told her about Mordecai, her uncle, she was in great distress. She sent clothes for him to put on instead of his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to her, to attend her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and explain to her. And he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, "All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death, unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king." When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer: "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: "Go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went and carried out all of Esther's instructions. This is one of those moments in between the feasts, one of those chance moments. And it's not as if faith in these kinds of moments is not something scary, right? This is a scary moment for young Queen Esther. This is the faith moment for Esther that will require her to go in and to go all in, right? To push all her chips into the middle, to put everything on the line. She says, "I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." That is the moment, that verse is the moment when Esther becomes a heroine of incredible faith. And what led up to this moment, right, is Mordecai saying to her, "Stop, pause, look at your life. Look at the moments leading up to this very moment. Look at all those in-between chance moments that brought you here. Look at the way God has been preparing you and setting the stage for such a time as this. This is your moment to shine. But who knows that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" To all of our graduates out there, this book speaks wisdom into your life. It is no secret that we live in a culture that is growing more and more secular. Every day we look more like this ancient Persian context. There are maybe times in your own life that you've asked, "God, where are you?" Because on first glance, he's completely missing from the pages. This is an incredibly powerful book that challenges you to look at those spaces between the lines. This book ends with a feast that the Jews would celebrate every single year because God's not done working. He continues to work. Sometimes directly in our story, like Abraham or Caleb that we've seen in previous weeks. But sometimes God is just as much at work but it's in between the lines. He shows up in the spaces that pass by between the big moments. And we might never notice until we pause and reflect. Until a Mordecai comes into our life, interrupts us, and says, "Who knows but that you have come to your very position for a time such as this?" To follow in Esther's footsteps is not easy. It might require you to say, if I look stupid, I look stupid. If I get made fun of, I get made fun of. If I perish, I perish. To parents, friends, family, those surrounding those graduates, Esther would never have become the heroine of incredible faith without Mordecai in her life. These young graduates need you to speak into their lives. They will need you to help them see the God moments between the lines and be willing to ask, who knows that you have come to this very position for such a time as this? See, all of us here at different moments in our life, we might be Esther one day, and we might be Mordecai the next. But what we all need in order to follow in their footsteps is to start recognizing when God has been at work in the background moments. See, in the book of Exodus, God is at work, right? God delivers his people through Moses. God speaks his name through Moses for the first time. In the book of Exodus, God's presence is splitting the Red Sea. He's coming down in fireballs, right? It's incredible. But in the book of Esther, God delivers his people, and his name is never even spoken. God's presence is just as much at work. He's delivering his people from annihilation, from a new Pharaoh figure, right? But you might miss it if you don't pause and see the spaces in between. Ultimately, this book of Esther is trying to teach us that, man, sometimes in our life, God will be present in ways that are easy to see, but other times, it's not as easy to see. The Feast of Purim, that feast of chance, where almost ironically, right, if you really think about it, the feast is designed to remember the moments that happened to the story that weren't feasts. It's designed to remember the moments in between the feasts when the real big things happened. And here's my closing question for you this week. Where has God been at work in your life in those in-between moments? Maybe it was this last week. Could it be that God has been preparing you to speak, preparing you to act, preparing you to innovate or lead, preparing you for something that lies ahead you haven't even seen yet? We live in a similar time as Esther, where followers of Jesus face obstacles and obstructions. But who knows that you have come to this very position for such a time as this? Let's pray together. Father, I just ask that you would help us in those moments where, life can pass by so quickly. We can get busy, we can get excited, we can be on to the next thing. Esther didn't even know what was happening behind the scenes until Mordecai brought it to her attention. She didn't even know that the edict was happening. Would you help us in those moments where you've called us to be that Mordecai? To step out in courage? To step out in faith? To ask the right questions? To help those around us see those in-between moments where you've been working in their lives, and help challenge them to step out in faith. Father, in those moments, And I know that there's graduates in here that they're in that Esther moment where, man, maybe there's something that lays before them that's kind of scary. For Esther, the safe thing would be to not say anything. The safe thing, no one knows she's Jewish. The safe thing would just to enjoy her queen position. But man, you have called some of these graduates for such a time as this, to step out in faith, to be challenged. And sometimes it takes that moment of that faith moment. Okay, if I perish, I perish. If I get made fun of, I get made fun of. Because God has placed us in this world, in this context, for such a time as this. So I pray that you would just be blessing those graduates, bless those in this room as they encourage those graduates as well. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.